guys, welcome to week 8 of the Bomber budget build. This week we're going to tackle some more of the front end. Now, for the most part, that front axle is pretty close to stock. We have changed the locker and we've put new links on it, and of course the servo. But the axle parts itself, mostly stock. Now, knuckles and C-hubs are what most people go to first as far as that upgrade point. However, I'm not going to say that that is the most important thing. I am actually going to tackle the axle shafts this week. The dog bone axle shafts that come in these cars can actually cause the failures that people see with their knuckles and C-hubs. What happens is those dog bones will either slightly bend or they'll oversteer, end up coming around and forcing the stub axle up, breaking a C-hub or a knuckle. Or if they just bend, it's a constant uneven force on the knuckle and C-hub. So for the upgrade this week, I'm going to go with our Incision line again and use the Wraith VDIs. Now, the Wraith AR60, Bomber, axle, all the same axle. It's the AR60 axle from Axial. The axles in this car are the exact same as came in the Axial Wraith, with a couple simple differences with like the link mounts and knuckles. Other than that, exact same axles. So those VDIs are going to work great in this car. Let's jump right into the installation of those pieces and show you guys how they go into this car.
As usual, remove the wheels and tires from the vehicle first. Next, we're going to remove the tie rod to allow easier removal of that knuckle. Loosen the set screw holding the 12mm hex in place, and then pull that axle pin out. Next, we're going to remove the top and bottom screws holding the knuckle onto the axle. When removing the knuckle, make sure to hold on to that flange pipe, as Axial calls it, or a knuckle bushing. Then you're free to remove the stub axle. To remove the inner axle shaft, you will need to remove one of the bolts holding that lower link/shock mount in place. Then you'll be able to pull that inner axle shaft out easily. Here I could tell that my inner axle shaft had quite a bit of bend to it. You can see it most predominantly on the outer part, but you can see the entire inner shaft has a little bit of a bow to it. This definitely could become an issue, and this axle shaft was likely to fail soon. Here you can see that the CVD style axle that we're going to install into the car. Again, these are the Incision VDI brand. Now we can slide that back into the axle again with one of those lower link mount bolts removed. We are going to replace it. Then I'm going to spin the axle, and this is when we will note if there's any rubbing on those screws. Here you can see a little bit of it that was on there. Now, I am going to remove a little bit of the threads on that bolt. This won't weaken the bolt, it's just the thread part. You don't have to do this, but it is recommended if you want the most smooth spinning drivetrain. Once you've done that, you can reinstall everything just as you took it apart. For one last check of our installation, I'm going to remove the drive shaft. Then I'm going to spin the front axle. You should get several rotations out of it to just make sure that there's no binding happening. If it stops after just a rotation or so, you definitely need to go back and check for binding.
Now, with the simple installation of those axle shafts completed, there was a couple of other things that I wanted to get done this week. Now, if you took your Bomber out of the box when it was stock and just cycled the front suspension, you may have noticed that that servo horn up front has a tendency to catch on part of that front bumper chassis area. So, as a simple modification, you can simply grab your Dremel, as I'm going to do, and trim out a little bit of that front bumper area just to make sure that you've got completely bind-free suspension travel throughout the entire range of motion. And lastly, I've got one more simple little modification that I like to do on a lot of my trucks. One of my biggest pet peeves is losing lower spring cups. It's just a pain. You either have to find one from a stock shock laying around, it either doesn't match or doesn't fit well. So to try and help that, especially after putting axle shafts on that will help increase steering angle, those tires can get over and start to rub the shocks at times. So if they do that, they have a tendency to lift up the spring cup and eject it. To stop that, what I do is I use a small piece of this 26 gauge florist wire. I'll grab it at Hobby Lobby, your hobby shop may have it, and I simply tie a little piece around the shock cup and the spring. Twist it tight, fold it over, make sure it's just out of the way, nothing to catch on, and a super simple little mod that will keep you from losing spring cups. This is something I almost always try to do, especially on aftermarket shocks, when those lower spring cups may be slightly specialized, have a little bit different height, or use a spring diameter that is not standard to what I may have in my box. One last topic that I apologize for not touching on last week. Now, as you guys know, I am running the Tekin RX-8 speed control in this car. The reason I bring that up is because last week we did install a high torque servo. Normally, if you're running a stock ESC, you will need to pair a high voltage, high power servo with an external Castle Creations BEC. Now, I've done videos on how to install a Castle Creations BEC in the past. The simplest way is to pick up one of the Holmes Hobbies BEC bypass systems. It's plug and play. You plug the BEC in, you plug your servo in, you plug it all in to the receiver, and you're done. The reason that I didn't touch on that last week and I completely spaced it was because the RX-8 has a nice, powerful, adjustable BEC built in. Depending on the servo you use, you may not have to use it, but it's 20 bucks that will really get more power out of that investment that you're putting into your servo. So really, really think about adding a BEC whenever you're going to a more powerful servo. Just something that I really wish I wouldn't have forgotten specifically on a servo episode, but hopefully this helps some of you guys pick up a BEC. You'll get more power out of your servo. They're easy to install as long as you just pick up the right parts, and it's just cheap insurance to get the most bang for your buck out of the parts that you've already invested in. So with all of that wrapped up, that's all I'm going to cover for this week. Pretty short and simple, but the parts that are coming into this car are just helping us get this thing more and more ready to be the most dependable car that you can have. With that, guys, that's all I've got for this week. Thanks for watching. Catch us on week 9 next Friday.